This verdict that's come in is a big deal. It's this case in California. And the reason it's a big deal is because Meta, which owns Instagram and Facebook, and then YouTube, which is owned by Google, have been found liable in this case, which is essentially about social media addiction. So it's about a 20-year-old who is called Kaylee, goes by the name of Kaylee, who sued these companies. Several of the companies, actually, some settled, some ended up in court, saying that the impact of being addicted to social media as a kid massively has impacted her and her mental health. TikTok and Snap actually settled before the case began, which is why we're focusing on Meta and YouTube. They argued there's no evidence that the issues that this young woman experienced were because of our platforms. Obviously, she argued the opposite. Her lawyers argued the opposite. And the jury found them liable, which means that she's getting awarded something like $6 million. So $3 million in compensation and $3 million that's like punitive damages.
And the reason this is such a big deal is because this is not just one person. This is what's called a bellwether case. There are over 10,000 minors or young adults who allege harm or addiction caused by social media companies. There are over 800 school districts who allege this. And this case was picked because it's representative of a large number of these cases of children and young people being allegedly harmed by social media. She's one. This now changes everything. But what is so interesting about this case and this litigation is the clever way that the prosecution have made this about how the platforms are designed, not the content on the platform. So until now, loads of people have tried to sue social media companies, but they've always been protected by a law called Section 230, which has also been called the 26 words that created the internet. It's basically a US law that means that social media companies and internet-based platforms cannot be held liable for the content people post on those platforms.
They're not publishers, that kind of argument.
Exactly. This one law has arguably allowed all these social media companies to become the force that shapes our world. But this litigation is so clever because it's not saying the specific content being published is the issue. Therefore, free speech is not the question here. It's alleging that these platforms are intentionally designed in a way that makes young people addicted, and that not only that, but these companies knew that and did it anyways.
And that's what's so striking about this is it's about design. And what this jury has come back and said is this is deliberate. They make these design choices and these design choices have an impact on people. It's not happening sort of by accident or as a byproduct. It is a kind of conscious, intentional decision. And that feels really different from anything that's come before.
Absolutely. And it's because one pro-anorexia video, for example, in itself is arguably defensible by free speech and isn't that harmful. But if a platform is designed in theory to send 10,000 pro-anorexia videos to one person, the way that platform designed, they allege, is intentionally harmful.
The companies obviously disagree with this verdict. They've made that very clear. Meta said, quote, "Teen mental health is profoundly complex and cannot be linked to a single app. We will continue to defend ourselves rigorously as every case is different, and we remain confident in our record of protecting teens online." And then a spokesperson for Google said, "This case misunderstands YouTube, which is a responsibly built streaming platform, not a social media site." And both of them are going to appeal this case. And obviously you imagine that they've got one eye on the other cases that might
the other 9,999
that could end up
cases.
the same way or not. And I think just, I mean, it really reminds me of that thing we've spoken about before, which is how the companies have often argued we are a mirror, like we're holding up a mirror to society. We don't actually affect people. It's just we're reflecting it back to you. And essentially what this case says is that is not true. Like, these are proactive systems. They are features that you've designed and implemented, and they're having an impact.
This comes around the same time as Meta being ordered to pay around $375 million in a New Mexico case for allegedly misleading users about the safety of its platform. Now, this is possibly the worst week for social media companies ever. Zuck is not happy this week. I actually did an exclusive interview with Anna Lembke, the author of Dopamine Nation, who was an expert witness in the California trial. And she's also a world-leading addiction psychiatrist. This is what she said about the verdict.
I didn't know that the public was ready to identify just how addictive social media can be. And my worry was that so many people themselves use social media that they would want to normalize it and not look at the problematic piece of it. Adults are not obviously immune to this problem, and I think that probably did impact the jury verdict. I suspect that in describing these phenomenon, the jury saw themselves in this behavior, and it resonated. They said, yeah, this is true. I've had this experience on these platforms. Early on, people were likening it to big tobacco litigation. I think that's a fair analogy. But I had this sense that maybe we would have to lose a bunch of cases before we would win them. But it's clear to me that we have reached a tipping point, that even with these very beginning trials, we're getting guilty verdicts, we're getting, large punitive damages. This is going to change things for these corporations.
To me, it's really interesting thinking about how a jury would respond in this case, because I guess the thing about social media is that it is just so universal, and yet it increasingly feels like, and maybe this is just the state of my DMs and why I feel like this, that people are much more aware, much more vigilant as to what they're being pushed, why they're being pushed, how the platforms actually work. And so it strikes me that someone like Anna, who knows loads about this, was kind of like, I'm not sure whether people are going to realise that this is the impact that the sites are having. And what seems to have happened is actually they've heard the evidence and thought, oh, I kind of recognise this.
Yeah, because although these cases are about young people and children, this applies to adults too. This applies to all of us. And when Anna Lembke was explaining how these platforms are designed with something called persuasive design to keep us on them as long as possible, it resonated so much with me, I began to realize that I was addicted too. They have neuroscientists, the top neuroscientists in the world, working on this. This stuff comes from the world of gambling, of slot machines. These are features like infinite scroll, autoplay. There's also recommendation algorithms, follower counts, which give you dopamine because the perception that you are being liked by a social group becomes addictive, the sense of FOMO, push notifications. These are all intentionally built in because they know exactly how to keep you hooked and how to control your dopamine reward cycle in your brain. Where it kind of gets quite neuroscience-y and I think quite sinister is in this concept of novelty, uncertainty, and variable rewards. The way our brain works, the way dopamine in our brain works, is a constant dopamine stream, a constant reward, actually gives us less dopamine, keeps us less hooked than variable. Here's a bit, now we take it away. Here's a bit, now we take it away. They use this novelty uncertainty principle where they intentionally do not let the algorithm give you exactly what you want all the time, because that actually keeps you going back for more rather than getting what you want all the time. Then you kind of feel sated and you're tolerant to the dopamine. So they give you a bit of dopamine, then they stop. Bit of dopamine, stop.
And you don't want to become almost like desensitized to that level of dopamine. Or
they don't want you to.
They don't want you to. Yeah, you want to.
The idea that you are always about to get the thing that you want is apparently one of the most potent ways to keep us hooked. So when you think of a slot machine, if you need 3 lemons and it'll do 1 lemon, then it'll give you another.
You nearly
lemon,
get it.
Then a cherry.
Yeah.
That is how these algorithms are designed.
We know that intermittent rewards are actually more addictive than reliable rewards. So when those rewards come at an unpredictable interval, or we're not quite sure when we're going to get the reward, we're more likely to stay engaged in anticipation of that unknown reward. These companies have incorporated that kind of slot machine design knowingly into their product, such that you have this pull to refresh phenomenon, or the quote unquote mystery of the algorithm, their language, such that part of what keeps us engaged is this kind of treasure seeking function, not knowing, what's around the next algorithmic bend.
If you become tolerant to the same kind of reward, they then switch it up and give you a different version of that. She compared this to if you're addicted to cookies and someone's like shoving a chocolate chip cookie in your face constantly, and then you're like, okay, I actually don't want any more chocolate chip cookies. That's when they would switch it, and now it's a chocolate chip cookie with almonds.
Yeah, so it's different. You're mixing it up a bit. You're like, oh, okay, this is a variation on a theme that I quite like.
And the novelty uncertainty thing would be like, actually, I'm not going to give you any more chocolate chip cookies. I'm just going to give you oranges and apples. And you're like, oh.
And then you're like, oh, and then you get a cookie again, and you're like, yes.
Exactly.
And I mean, when I talk to people who work within the social media companies, especially engineers, I'd say, so those are the people basically in charge of designing and controlling these algorithmic systems. I mean, they talk about that like ultimately they are optimizing for engagement, whatever the cost. And I guess the best way of optimizing for engagement is to operate this kind of like reward withdraw type system.
You brought up earlier this argument that they've often made that we're just holding a mirror up to you. You are the ones making the content. This is what you are creating and what you want to see. We're just, we're just posting it. But this is so different from what we've heard in this trial. Not only are they not holding up a mirror to us, but I mean, things like FOMO. We've all felt FOMO when looking at social media. But to know that they arguably are aware of FOMO and are intentionally putting it in the product to give that to you. There's like a neuroscientist sat there being like, more FOMO. I mean, it's terrifying.
I imagine that's live scenes from any social media headquarters you can think of. But this is the point, and actually I think this is where, when we think about the consequences of this case and the other cases, what they could be, people within the companies, they tell me the biggest worry is that they are asked, not necessarily in the United States because of the current sort of political environment and the approach to the companies, but certainly in other places, they're basically asked to overhaul their models. Like, they're asked to overhaul their entire algorithmic structures and how they operate, which is what makes them all the money. Like, that's the thing. If they then got to have more proactive moderation, slower algorithms, they've got to, I don't know, separate out like the platforms that kids are on and teenagers are on to the kind of main ones. All of that is incredibly expensive to execute and actually gets rid of all the things, like it's the FOMO and the keeping you scrolling that is hugely valuable to them, which is why they've continued to build on that rather than the opposite. And I guess like I guess if you're working inside a social media company this week and you support what they're doing, you'd be thinking, whoa, do we risk being regulated in a much harsher way that's much more difficult for us to deal with in some places? Do we risk getting banned in much more places? And also the public perception point, which might explain why some of the companies settled and others didn't. Because now it's kind of like Meta, and in this case, Meta and YouTube in big sort of bold lights are the ones who, if you use social media, you might be looking and thinking, oh, maybe I don't want to use those platforms then if that's the case.
I think there is a tipping point. I think people are waking up to this, and the perception of social media as a bad thing is growing really, really fast. I think people are comparing this to big tobacco now. Another aspect of big tobacco is they can't advertise to adults either. So, we're focusing on children now for good reason, but there are huge questions to be raised about, should they be allowed to do this to us?
Digital media is a legal drug. I mean, it's the Wild West, but it's also a legal drug. And we as a society have determined that we can't market addictive drugs to kids. So if we extend the analogy, then we have a perfect argument for saying, gee whiz, maybe kids shouldn't be allowed to go on these addictive platforms. One of the things that really came out in this litigation is that there are lots of tweens and even younger children on defendants' platforms, and the platforms know that they're there and are mostly doing nothing about it. I don't think there's ever going to be a day when we make digital drugs illegal, but I do think that there needs to be much more transparency, more warning. People need to really appreciate that that the digital media is a powerful tool, but also potentially a potent drug.
It is worth us saying, obviously, that there's a chance that the other cases don't go in the same direction as this one. That it is very much case by case. It's a test case, not class action here. And so the companies, and you really notice this in Meta's response to this case, they are like, it's case by case. We've got to see what happens. And, as someone who investigates social media, I don't know if you find this, Matt, there are real examples where people properly evidence the impact that social media has had on them. There are also examples of where people kind of point to harm and it's not quite what it seems. Obviously, you'd imagine that, when a case gets as far as being in court like this, that there's pretty significant evidence to back it up. But that's not to say that it's all going to completely go in this direction. It might end up being not quite so straightforward as that. Yeah,
and I think one can imagine that Zuck and the others are horrified by the prospect that it does, because imagine $6 million in damages, times 10,000. And it's also interesting to note that Meta, in this case, owe 70% of the damages. YouTube.
More than YouTube, yeah.
The other 30%. So YouTube perhaps was considered less addictive and problematic in this case.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, the idea that the social media platforms vary in terms of the possible harm that they might be able to cause to you. I mean, YouTube in particular, when I was doing the investigation about algorithms, I looked into YouTube as I did all the big companies, but in terms of the evidence to back up like what's happening right now and making decisions that exacerbate harm or exacerbate the problem. There was lots of evidence when it came to several of the other companies, but actually YouTube in some ways, and they highlight this in their response, have tried to move from being kind of old rabbit hole YouTube, you know, where people would end up like goodness knows where, into we're like a streamer, we're like, you know, we're like a video platform. That's not to say there's not problems, of course there are, but you also have to remember that a lot of these cases are about the experiences that teenagers had growing up.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is clearly going to have huge ramifications for how social media companies, who are mainly based in the US, where this litigation is happening, deal with children. Age verification will potentially have to become more stringent. Algorithms will potentially have to be rewritten.
Or you just operate completely separate platforms altogether. Like you literally have to have
platforms potentially.
Different spaces. I mean, it could mean social media in the way that we have known it for kind of our whole lives is a really different thing, certainly for people in like 5-10 years time. But that does raise the question of like, do they have to entirely rebuild their platforms? Like, do they have to start from scratch? I mean, lots of people talk about safety by design. Like the problem is that the designs don't feel inherently safe. And a lot of the engineers I speak to say it's kind of a black box. It doesn't feel like we can fix the algorithms very easily. And that's sort of why we're here in court.
But that excuse may no longer hold water now that this litigation has happened. This also has ramifications for AI companies and whether their content is harmful for children. And ultimately, it sets a precedent in which tech companies in general can be held liable for the way their products are designed and whether those designs are harmful and addictive, not just for young people, for all of us. So this could change everything.